Hello, everyone. Gary here from Timeline Astrology. This is all about Trump's tariffs. Why him? Why now? And what might happen in the coming months and into next year. I'm going to show you a couple of charts, his birth chart and the chart of the time he signed the order, and why it was the worst time to sign an order. And at the same time, why for him this is all lined up. He, in a way, was born for this, as in he was born to shake up the whole world economy. And I'm going to show you that in his birth chart, first of all. So let's look at the charts. You're probably familiar with Donald Trump's chart if you're following astrology in any way at all, because he is such a potent chart. He has such an interesting chart. It's endlessly fascinating. So, but if you're not familiar with the sidereal that I use here, the star signs, he has, of course, Leo rising with Mars and Leo. That's actually the same in the tropical. He has Jupiter and Neptune conjoined in his second sign of money, and that's relevant now. We have Venus and Saturn conjoined in his 12th sign, which is also relevant now. And we have the Sun, his ruler, and Rahu, the North Node, with Uranus in his 10th house sign. And in a way, that's the most relevant. So, first of all, I want to just talk you through the outer planets, first of all, how all of the outer planets are lined up right now by transit, triggering his chart. Why, in just simple terms, he was born for this. And again, as in he was born to shake up all of the world economy, because he was born with Uranus in Taurus in the 10th house sign, conjunct his ruler Sun and the North Node, Rahu. Uranus has just moved back into Taurus since the end of March 2025. Do you think that's a coincidence? Of course it's not. This is just the beginning of a big shakeup in the world economy for the next 7 years with Uranus moving through Taurus. So that's why I say he was born for this in one way. He's been talking about tariffs for decades now, but this is the timing of it. This is now literally as Uranus returns to his natal Uranus. But we also have everything else lined up. Neptune is in the second house sign with Jupiter, which is currently the Time Lord, the Indian Dasha system of timing. We have Jupiter active right now, as well as Venus. So it's Jupiter at Venus. Jupiter's on one side of his ascendant, Venus on the other. That sort of cushions him, I think, protects him in some way, and also just simply gains him more wealth. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the fifth and eighth Lord Jupiter in his second house of money. So this is all about gathering wealth for himself and his family. But I don't know if that means that it also gathers wealth for the economy for the US. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, that's what tariffs and taxes are for, is it not? So yes, there might be also some collection of taxes there, but it's so volatile, and I'm going to show you why that is. And it's not helping his cause in any way, shape, or form. And again, when he signed was the worst time to sign. And I think it's going to really not work out well for him in terms of his presidency. But at any rate, again, personally, I do think this is still about him amassing wealth. But Neptune is with Jupiter, which is the other side of that, which is just confused in a way. It's not clear. It's at least a bit idealistic and has a lot of notions that might not be very clear. And now Neptune is opposing his natal Neptune. Neptune is in Pisces right now. So in the eighth sign of taxes and tariffs, and that's just confused everything, opposing his natal Neptune. So you can see Uranus has returned in his chart. It happens when we're in our 80s. Neptune is opposing where it is in his chart in the house of taxes, opposite his second house of wealth. And then finally, Pluto has started to move through his sixth house sign, and it's opposing his natal Pluto. He's got Pluto in the 12th house sign, Cancer, conjunct Saturn and Venus, quite a wide orb, but still they're all there together in his 12th house sign. Saturn and Venus are now also conjunct in his eighth sign, and that actually is what led to the crash, the recent stock market crash. Venus was retrograde conjunct Saturn. Venus is his 10th lord of Taurus, and now Pluto is opposite. And so we have this kind of Pluto theme going on as well underneath it all, which is essentially Pluto and Capricorn is the breakdown of the world order. So now you're talking about the whole breakdown of the whole world order with Pluto and Capricorn in a trine to Uranus just having moved into Taurus, again, furthering that cause. And then in the middle of both of them, we have Neptune in Pisces, opposite his second house, in his eighth house of taxes, sort of assisting all of that and blurring everything and making it all really confused. So you can see just with the outer planets alone, his birth chart is completely lined up with what's going on right now. We could also add that Jupiter and Saturn are in a sextile, and in the Indian system, Saturn has a special aspect or drishti or sight on the third house from it. So Saturn in his natal chart is aspecting Jupiter. That's happening again. Saturn is in Pisces. It just moved into Pisces. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to flip the chart now and show you the time he signed, which was at 3:31 p.m. on the 2nd of April on Liberation Day, as he so called it. This is interesting because now you have, just as he signed, Leo began to rise, placing all of these planets that have gathered in Pisces in the eighth whole sign. And again, what is the eighth sign? It's taxes, it's tariffs. At the time, Mars had just moved into Cancer, sidereal Cancer, 0 degrees, 0 minutes, right on the edge. And I call this the shoot yourself in the foot transit, Mars in the 12th house. This was the worst time to sign. And again, even whatever he does from here on out, this is when he signed the order, and it's always going to have this quality about it. Again, Mars in the 12th, all of these planets in the 8th, including a Mercury and Venus retrograde. Like I'm sure you've heard if you follow any astrologer, you don't want to sign important documents during Mercury retrograde simply because you're missing out some details and you're not quite clear. And then as it goes forward, then you change your mind. As we can see, that's just happened. Mercury is now stationed direct, is starting to move forward, and he's changing his mind again, which is his nature anyway, because he has a very prominent Mercury in his 11th sign, Gemini, ruling his second sign of speech. So he constantly contradicts himself, obviously. But now you're placing it all in the eighth house, and this is not the best time, therefore, if he wanted to see this through and to make it clear and for it to work, if it was ever going to be able to work, I don't know. But this was the worst time to start it, if it was ever going to be able to work. It's not going to work with this. You also see the Venus retrograde, the 10th lord of his chart, and at the time of the signing in the eighth house, exchanging with Jupiter in the 10th house, that then exchanges eighth and 10th houses. That's an obstacle in his work, in his career, in, as a president. It's not good for him. And then they're also tightly wound up with these planets. Saturn just moved in, Rahu, the North Node, Neptune, and his ruler, the Sun, which was just eclipsed a few days before. Um, so this is obviously not a good time to sign such a thing. And then overall, because Saturn is really what's going to be left behind here with Neptune, I'm going to show you this now into the summer where I think it's going to get even more volatile and why I think that is. But Saturn overall for the next 2.5 years in Pisces, his eighth whole sign, which aspects his fifth sign, is even more troublesome because now it's aspecting his following. It's probably going to reduce his following and his support and his wealth and the country's wealth. Because if we're reading it from the perspective of him being a president, now we're talking about the US wealth, the US being impacted by all of this. Um, yeah, so it's just not looking good. And then Saturn, just like it is in his birth chart, has an aspect onto Jupiter again at the time of his signing. And Saturn is in Jupiter sign anyway, Pisces, which tends to restrict things. And Saturn, therefore, will likely restrict the economy, which is what Jupiter is all about. Jupiter is all about growth in the context of the economy. So this was the worst time, I think, for him to sign. I'm going to bring it forward 3 months because, of course, he has now said that he's putting a pause on these tariffs, worldwide tariffs, apart from China, which has been upped. And, the second largest economy in the world, that's not a small thing at all. But he's put a 90-day pause on the tariffs. And if we bring the astrology forward from this period, 90 days, where do we end up? We end up in a very volatile situation in July. So I'll bring it forward here to July and leave it at Leo rising just to see it from his perspective. What can you see here? I mean, this is troublesome. Mars is going to move into Leo by June, and then Ketu will have moved into Leo also by the end of May, and they come together in June and July, July more specifically, where that is itself a marker for stock market crashes. It has been throughout history. Not every time, but quite often. I thought there would have been a crash in October 2023 because of their conjunction. That was their last conjunction. And that was of course, the attack in Israel and that war in the Middle East. But that isn't to say, by the way, that there wouldn't be another attack here or some event like that or war. But now for me, it just looks more economic because unlike October 2023, where Saturn in Aquarius was sort of holding Mars back in a way, aspecting its signs, Saturn is no longer doing that. It's in Pisces, again, in the eighth sign for Trump, conjunct Neptune. And Mars in Leo is aspecting Saturn. Mars is said to have a special site on the eighth house from it in the Indian system. So this is volatile. This is likely to really challenge the Saturn-9 structures. And then Jupiter is in a square to Saturn, which is transiting its sign, Pisces. It does look completely like it's all falling apart at this point. Now, it could be because of, you know, you're given 90 days reprieve on the tariffs, but then you know it's kicking in. And then now you know, and then people that are invested in the market are going to get spooked and then pull their money out of the market. This is what happens in a stock market crash. People panic. This looks like absolute panic, this kind of astrology. I mean, there might be some things that save the day, I don't know, but like Venus is in the 10th house sign, Taurus, but it's conjunct Uranus. That's itself a trigger. And then later on in July, then Mercury goes retrograde. So it really just does not look good. Now, again, you have to take all of this with a pinch of salt. I'm not an economist. I don't know. I'm looking at the astrology. It looks volatile. It could express itself in other ways. Who knows? But it does look volatile in terms of the economy and especially end of June into July. But then bringing it forward, I'm going to point out that Jupiter by mid-May goes into Gemini in a way that is maybe better for him personally, Trump, with Jupiter in the 11th house in terms of his, again, earning money, personally. But then Jupiter, by the end of the year, by October 18th, will go into Cancer, into his 12th host sign. And not just for him, but for the world economy. This is troublesome, and I'm going to explain why. So now we're getting into the end of this year and actually into next year, because Jupiter will do this thing where it peaks into Cancer, but then by the 11th of November, it will station retrograde. So let me bring it back to Leo from that perspective, and you'll see it here. It stations retrograde from the 11th. Now, why is that a problem? Well, I'm going to bring your awareness back to the 1930s. And in the 1930s, Jupiter was in Cancer in the beginning of the 30s. And so don't think that, okay, Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, that's going to save the day. Not necessarily, because it was actually when Jupiter had made it to the very end of Cancer and had stationed retrograde that the banks crashed in 1931. So now what we're seeing is by the end of 2025, Jupiter move into the first degree of Cancer and then station retrograde in November, at which time Saturn will have moved back to where it had begun this whole journey of this putting these tariffs in place. This is the other thing to consider here is that Saturn goes back and forth every year, as does Jupiter. And Saturn is again in his eighth house of tariffs, right? And he's having to go back all the way to the beginning. And this back and forth is the problem. And now you're adding in Jupiter going back, although exalted, retrograde behaves as if it's debilitated, just as with Venus exalted in Pisces, retrograde saw the initial crash in April 2025. Now in November 2025, we're back again to the beginning of this Saturn. Then we're again putting in another planet that would represent the economy in a precarious position in exaltation and retrogradation equals debilitation. And then opposing Pluto. So this does not look good. Now, and then afterwards, because it then goes back into Gemini, and then it's almost like going back to the drawing board and trying to figure things out. But then afterwards, as it goes back into Cancer next year, it does look more hopeful, 2026. I'm going to show you that in June of 2026. But then there's a further complication. And again, I'll bring it back to Leo just so you can see it from that perspective. Okay, it's exalted now in earnest, right? So it does look more hopeful, summer of 2026. However, When you have this kind of hope opposite Pluto, with Saturn again in Pisces, continuing its transit there, it's almost like hope because of despair, hope because of fear. You don't have, hope without fear. And vice versa. If you fear something, you hope for something better. If you hope for something, it means that you fear something, that there is something to fear. And I think there is at this point, but it still looks better than the end of this year, 2025, in one way. However, there's another thing going on, and I want to show you this because Jupiter is going to go back and forth just as it did in the early 30s during the Great Depression. It's going to go back and forth at the end of Cancer in 2026. And so this is a bit more worrisome because as it moves into Leo initially, it conjoins Ketu and then will retrograde back into Cancer yet again by the end of 2026 into the beginning of 2027. And this was also a signature for the Great Depression. Jupiter had conjoined Ketu in Leo after it had made it out of Cancer. And in this case, as in end of 2026, 2027, it's going to go back into Cancer 2027. Remember, retrograde at the very end of the sign Cancer in January of 2027, just as it was when the banks crashed in 1931. So I know that's going way ahead, and I obviously don't know what's going to happen. I'm just hypothesizing here that this could be a major economic challenge when you add this Jupiter retrograde, exalted retrograde equaling debilitation, conjunct Ketu, the south node of losses, in the 12th house from Leo again for him specifically, if he's still president. This is looking like trouble. Essentially, then you have a Mars retrograde on top of all of that in the beginning of 2027 in Leo. And again, further aspect onto Saturn, which is continuing its transit with Neptune in the eighth house. Again, I'll maybe just repeat myself, but it's worth repeating that this was the worst time to sign this order for these tariffs. For the tariffs themselves, at least, anyway, but really for the world and the world economy, because this is impacting the world, as you can see, in a very negative way. And it's going to be all over the place and it's going to get a lot more volatile, I'm afraid. So, again, take all of that with a pinch of salt. If you have any questions about any of that, please feel free to post below. If you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I hope that none of that transpires as I can see with the astrology that it's other ways. But then if it's other ways, then it's then unfortunately more violent. And that's the other side of the Mars Ketu conjunction, for example. And you don't have one without the other also. And that's the thing to say here is that, economic challenges tend to lead to wars. Again, think about the 1930s. One last thing I want to say about this, I've been saying it for quite a few years now, is that I do think the 2020s are almost like a condensed form of what happened between World War One and World War Two. And that's both good and bad news because if you condense it down into a decade, it's like, okay, we're having a lot going on in the 2020s, like a pandemic, economic challenges, another war. But in another way, we're getting over them quickly. And into the 2030s, I think by the mid 2030s, especially, I think we're on the other side of whatever this is. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Okay, until next time.